Thanks for joining us today, John. Today I wanted to talk about the deep state, or the permanent government, the part of our government that stays the same whatever happens in elections. You've worked for the CIA for 14 years, from 1990 to 2004. So firstly, I wanted to ask, how did that come about? Had you planned to do that as a young man, or was it a coincidence?
Sure. So I was in graduate school here in Washington at George Washington University. I had just finished a bachelor's degree in Middle Eastern studies, where I specialized on Islamic theology. It was fascinating to me. And then I stayed at GW to get a master's degree in legislative affairs with a focus on foreign policy analysis. And I was taking a class called The Psychology of Leadership that was being taught by an eminent psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Gerald Post. Multiple degrees from Yale and Harvard Medical School. He had an MD, a PhD in political science, and a PhD in psychology. And as part of this class, he gave us an assignment one day where we had to shadow our bosses for a week and then write a psychological profile of our bosses. I was working at the United Food and Commercial Workers Union at the time. And my boss was one of these old school union organizers, mean, tough. He had had his back broken during a strike, for example. And I was a little bit afraid of him, to tell you the truth. So I'm shadowing him during the week. And in the middle of the week, we got into an argument. And I called him a racist, which he was. He got so angry, he balled up his fists and set a stance. And I remember thinking, oh, I went too far this time. And I put my hands up to shield the inevitable punch that was coming. And he says, "My penis is bigger than yours." And I said, "What?" And he says, "My penis is bigger than yours." And I said, "You know what? You're nuts." And I quit. And I walked out. I went back to my apartment and I wrote the paper. And I recounted this story, and I concluded that he was a sociopath with psychopathic and possibly violent tendencies, and I, supported it with evidence. A week later, I get the paper back from Dr. Post, and he gave me an A. And in the margin, he wrote, "Please see me after class." And so I went up to him and I said, "Dr. Post, you wanted to see me?" He says, come to my office." We go down to the office. He closes the door and he says, "Listen, I'm not really a professor here. I'm a CIA officer undercover as a professor here. And I'm looking for people who might fit into the CIA's culture. Would you like to be a CIA officer?" The truth is, I had not given it any thought. I was getting married in 6 weeks and I had no job. And I was desperate to find a job. So I said, "Sure." I wanted to get into public service. I wanted to get into international affairs. I thought maybe I'd end up in the State Department or on Capitol Hill. But CIA, 6 of one or half dozen of the other. And the next thing I knew, I was in the CIA. Well, you can't do that anymore. That was outlawed in 1993 with passage of the Equal Employment Opportunity Act. Now it's far less sexy. Now you go to www.cia.gov and you click apply. With that said, what the CIA does now, and this is less than honest and probably unethical, is they will take officers nearing their 30th year in service, and they will say, "Hey, if you want to retire in your hometown, wherever your hometown happens to be in America, we can get you a professorship at the nearby local university. So you teach a course on, Soviet literature or on North African politics or whatever. But at the same time, you're looking for those people who might fit into the CIA's culture." Now, you can't call your buddy at CIA HR and say, "I've got one, hire him." You encourage them to go through the process. You introduce them to a recruiter. You tell them how to conduct themselves during the interviews. So essentially, it's the same kind of thing where the CIA is recruiting on campus.
It's really interesting to hear how infested with the CIA the university system is. And why do you think you were a candidate for professor post? What was it about you that interested him or thought that you were good for the CIA?
Well, Dr. Post had founded a unit at the CIA on the analytics side in the Directorate of Intelligence called the Political Psychology Division. It morphed into that and something else, something called the Office of Leadership Analysis. So I became Saddam Hussein's classified biographer for the American intelligence community. And I did that for 7.5 years, focusing solely on Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi leadership. He was looking for analysts. He was looking for people who took academia seriously. He was looking for people with an interest in psychology and people who already had awareness vis-a-vis the rest of the world. When I went for my formal interviews at the CIA, I was interviewed by 3 different analytic units, and then I was interviewed by the Near East Operations Division. And I was not a fit at the time for operations. And they essentially, stood up and shook my hand and said, best of luck. And that was it. I never heard from them again. So I went into analysis, liked it a lot for a while, traveled a lot. I've been to 72 countries. And then decided after 7.5 years that I was just bored with, sitting in a cubicle and thinking the big thoughts, and I wanted to do something different. So it was then that I made a very unusual transfer to counter-terrorist operations. And I always had a facility for foreign languages too. I speak Arabic and I speak Greek, and languages are very easy for me. So that helped a lot as well.
And what was it like inside the CIA? Was it as you expected? Because on the outside, we have all these ideas about what the CIA does, what it's like inside, and obviously there's many movies made about it. So are you seeing the evil stuff that the CIA is doing up close? Was it as sexy as it is in the movies?
Well, you know what? There are several ways to answer that question, and all of them are honest, but all of them are different. So, I had read all the books. I read The Rise and Fall of the CIA. I read Spycatcher. I read everything I could get my hands on before I ever walked through the door for the first time. So I wasn't a naif, but at the same time, I believed that the reforms enacted by the Church and Pike committees were real. And for a period, they were real. So between 1975 and 2001, with a couple of very notable exceptions, like, for example, Iran-Contra, there was real oversight over CIA operations. That just went out the window on 9/11. I mean, the CIA literally in 24 hours became a paramilitary, murder for hire organization. And it was never meant to be a paramilitary murder for hire organization. So for a while, I was happy with the reforms that I saw. Now, there were old timers who lamented the changes at the CIA and really missed the old days where they could just go around just killing people whose politics they disagreed with. I will say that I was really heartened in 1993 when Bill Clinton became president, because Bill Clinton ordered something called a cull. Bill Clinton took human rights very seriously, and he implemented a regulation at the CIA saying that the CIA was not permitted to have a relationship with any person who had human rights problems in his past. So, I mean, we were running agents who had, murdered nuns and priests in Latin America, or, who raped and murdered leftists. And on the other side, people would say, well, if you want to collect that kind of information, you have to roll around in the mud with the bad guys. Well, actually, no, you don't. You really don't. And Bill Clinton was right about that change. But again, that was one of those changes that went completely out the window on 9/11. I will say that, like most Americans, I was so angry about 9/11. I lost friends on 9/11. And I was so angry that I was willing to wait a little while to see what direction this thing went in. But then pretty quickly, it was clear that the direction that it was going in was illegal, it was unethical and immoral, and I couldn't be a part of it.
And you left the CIA in 2004, 3 years into the war on terror, and you were part of the core Directorate of Operations. So what had you seen in those 3 years of the war on terror? And is what you saw the reason that you left the CIA?
I left for two reasons. Well, to answer your first question first, I had returned from Pakistan in May of 2002. I had led the capture of Abu Zubaydah and dozens upon dozens of other al-Qaeda fighters. Abu Zubaydah is an entirely different conversation we can have, and a very sad one at that. And I went back to headquarters. And I was in the cafeteria one day, and a senior counterterrorism center officer walked up to me very casually and said, "Hey, glad I ran into you. Hey, I meant to ask you, do you want to be certified in the use of enhanced interrogation techniques?" I had never heard that phrase before. And I said, "Enhanced interrogation techniques, what does that mean?" And very excitedly, he said, "We're going to start getting rough with these guys." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" And then very calmly, he listed these 10 techniques. And I said, "Dude, that sounds like a torture program to me." And he says, "No, it's not a torture program." He said, "The Justice Department approved it and the president assigned it, and we're going to, or approved it. We're going to start doing it." And I said, "Give me an hour. I need to think about this." I went up to the 7th floor, the executive floor. There was a very, very senior officer there for whom I had worked in the Middle East a decade earlier, and I really trusted his judgment. So I knocked on the door, and I said, "Listen, I need some advice." I said, "I was just asked if I want to be certified in these enhanced interrogation techniques." I said, "This sounds like a torture program to me. What do you think about it?" And he said, and he later denied to a journalist that this conversation ever took place, but he said, "First of all, let's call a spade a spade. This is a torture program, and torture is a slippery slope." He said, "You know how these guys are. They're cowboys, and somebody's going to go too far, and they're going to kill a prisoner. And when that happens, there's going to be a congressional investigation, and then there's going to be a Justice Department investigation, and somebody's going to go to prison. Do you want to go to prison?" And I said, "No, I don't want to go to prison." As it turned out, I was the only person who went to prison, but that's later in the future. I went back downstairs, and I said, "This is a torture program. I have a moral and ethical problem with it. I don't care who signed it. I think it's illegal, and I want nothing to do with it." As it turned out, they had asked 14 of us. I was the only one who said no. And then, just a few weeks later, my promotion panel met, and the head of the Counterterrorism Center, at the time it was Jose Rodriguez, the notorious Jose Rodriguez, passed me over for promotion. I had just captured the alleged number 3 in al-Qaeda with these 2 hands. He said that I had displayed, his words, a shocking lack of commitment to counterterrorism. So that officer that I went to see had the authority to promote me out of cycle. And as soon as he learned that I had been passed over, he promoted me, which made me even less popular in the Counterterrorism Center.
Can you just explain the story of Abu Zubaydah a bit and your involvement in his case? Because he was captured by the US in March 2002 in Pakistan, and he was allegedly number 3 in al-Qaeda and involved in 9/11. So what was his story? What's the reality of his story, and what was your involvement?
Sure. In February of 2002, we received word at the CIA station that Abu Zubaydah was somewhere in Pakistan. And we believed at the time that Abu Zubaydah was the number 3 in al-Qaeda and that he was intimately involved in the 9/11 planning. None of that was true. He was never the number 3 in al-Qaeda. He was never even a member of al-Qaeda. He had never pledged fealty to Osama bin Laden. With that said, he was a bad guy. He acted as something of a logistician for al-Qaeda. He founded the House of Martyrs Safe House in Peshawar, Pakistan. He founded al-Qaeda's 2 training camps in Kandahar and Helmand provinces in southern Afghanistan. If you wanted to go to Afghanistan for training, he would get you in. If you were tired of the fight and wanted to go home, he would get you out. But a second problem, an equally grave problem, is that he had a first cousin who was also named Abu Zubaydah. And so at the CIA, we didn't know that there were 2 men named Abu Zubaydah. And we're getting these reports like, wow, Abu Zubaydah is planning an attack in Helmand. Oh my God, Abu Zubaydah is planning an attack in Jordan. Oh my God, Abu Zubaydah has a valid US visa and he was in Montana 2 years ago. It's like he's a terrorist Superman. But it was 2 different people. And so we began tracking him all over Pakistan. This is a very long story. I'm going to make it very short and say that on the night of March 28th, 2002, we found him and we caught him and captured him. Unfortunately, a Pakistani policeman whom I had told 2 hours ago, do not shoot him, shot him 3 times with an AK-47 in the groin, the thigh, and the stomach, gravely wounding him. But I sat with him for the next 56 hours. I tied him to his bed. He came out of his coma after about a day. We had meaningful, deep conversations. And then he was flown to the first of 6 black sites, secret prisons around the world that the CIA had created. He was the first one of our so-called high-value detainees who underwent torture. And I mean, his torture was merciless. And it was not just the 10 techniques that this former colleague had delineated for me. They were just winging it. Whatever grotesque, horrible torture technique they could think of or they could find on Google, they did to him, figuring that it was better to ask forgiveness later than it was to ask for permission in advance. And finally, after years of this treatment, he was transferred, I think it was in 2006, he was transferred to Guantanamo. He's still never been charged with a crime. Never. And if you look at the Senate torture report, there's a footnote in it in which the CIA says he must never be released under any circumstances, that he must never be given access to the outside world, and when he dies, he is to be cremated and his ashes thrown into the Caribbean. Well, I spoke to his lead attorney a week ago, and he told me several things. One that really warmed my heart. Two things that warmed my heart. Number one, he said that Abu Zubaydah was aware that we were speaking a week ago, and he sent his best regards. He says, the 2 of you have some slightly different recollections of what happened that night, but he says he hopes that you can have dinner together as free men. I've gone so far as to go on Twitter and apologize to Abu Zubaydah because he was captured based on a lie, or if you want to be generous, based on a mistake. And he's been denied the very constitutional protections that every American is so proud of. He has a constitutional right to face his accusers in a court of law. He has a constitutional right to be judged by a jury of his peers. He's never even been charged with a crime. Well, if he was the terrorist Superman they said he was, then by God, charge him and let him defend himself. And if you're not going to charge him, you must let him go. Number two, on the night that I blew the whistle on the CIA's torture program in December of 2007, a friendly guard at Guantanamo told him that I had gone public with the torture program. He said that he cried because the world would finally know what was being done to him and to these others in the name of freedom and counterterrorism. And he said that it completely changed the mood of the Guantanamo detainees, that for the very first time they believed that maybe there was going to be justice at the end of all this. And the last point I want to make, the CIA's protestations notwithstanding, we have released hundreds and hundreds of people from Guantanamo, almost across the board, people utterly innocent of having committed any crime, let alone the crime of terrorism. There are advanced discussions underway whereby Abu Zubaydah reportedly would take a plea to something. They're trying to figure out to what. He would be found guilty and sentenced to time served and expelled. So there's a parallel negotiation taking place. Now, when we release people from Guantanamo, in about 50% of the cases, they're released back to their home countries. So if you're Jordanian, you go to Jordan. You're, Tunisian, you go to Tunisia. You're Pakistani, you go to Pakistan. Some people can't go back to their countries because they'll be killed there or tortured again. In the case of Abu Zubaydah, he has no country to go back to. He was born in Saudi Arabia, but he's a Palestinian. So he has no right of return to Saudi Arabia and can't go to Palestine. So what the US government has done in those cases, and there have been many, many Guantanamo detainees in this predicament, is the State Department will negotiate with a country, and that country will take that person in, give them refugee status, and in many cases, eventually citizenship. So there are former Guantanamo prisoners in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, Albania, Tahiti, Belize, Chile, wherever they can make a new life. There was a prisoner released recently who went to Belize. He had never heard of Belize. And I saw an interview that he gave. And he said it's paradise, that he has a relationship with the woman for the first time in 20 years, that he's looking forward to being a father, that the Belize government has given him assistance and food and an apartment and job training, and he's actually starting a new life. Now, we've also heard that from 4 Uyghurs in Tahiti and 2 Uyghurs in Albania and Mohammed Ould Slahi in the Netherlands and, countless people elsewhere around the world. So I'm genuinely hopeful that this innocent man will finally be released, that I can apologize to him in person for what my government has done to him, and that he can finally salvage something of his life.
It's interesting listening to you because one forgets the lawlessness of the CIA during the war on terror, the black sites, the held without detention for decades, the torture. It's unbelievable, really, that it was allowed to happen. And you left the CIA in 2004, but you weren't kicked out. You left for your own reasons, and you didn't blow the whistle until a TV interview in 2007. So when you left in 2004, was that with the knowledge that you would blow the whistle, or did that happen because of later circumstances?
Right, that's a good question. I left in 2004 for 2 reasons. Number one, this program was out of control. And this was not the CIA I had joined in 1990. It was a different world. It was a paramilitary organization. And secondly, I was divorced, remarried, and I had 2 young children, and they needed their father in their lives. So I was offered 2 station chief jobs in the Middle East, and I just couldn't just walk away from my children. They were 6 and 9 at the time. Just walk away for 3 years and say, well, I hope I'll be back in 3 years. Maybe I'll be back in 6 years. You can't do that to a child. So I decided to leave. But in the interim, when I got back from Pakistan, on the strength of the Abu Zubaydah capture, I was given this amazing promotion and took a new job as the executive assistant to the CIA's deputy director for operations. And in that position, I got to see literally everything that the CIA was doing around the world. And, you know, we're getting these reports back from the secret sites, literally the blow by blow of merciless torture, clearly illegal, monstrous torture taking place. And I kept waiting for somebody to say something. This is so patently illegal. Surely somebody is going to say something. And then I began seeing reporting cables coming back from the field. For example, one of the secretaries resigned. She said, I did not sign on to be an accomplice to torture, and she resigned. One of the doctors from the Office of Medical Services said, I took an oath to do no harm. I'm not going to be complicit in this, and he resigned. Other people were asking for what's called a curtailment, where you cut your tour short and return to headquarters. That's a career-ending move, to curtail an assignment. And I thought, wow, okay, so I'm not the only one who thinks this is crazy. Surely somebody's going to say something. And then nobody ever said a word. So I resigned to spend more time with my kids. And I took a job in the private sector, waiting for somebody to come forward. Nobody did. And then 3.5 years later, Brian Ross called me from ABC News. And he said he had a source who said that I had tortured Abu Zubaydah. I said that was absolutely untrue. I was the only person who was kind to Abu Zubaydah. I said, your source is either mistaken or he's a liar. And he said, well, I didn't know this was a reporter's trick because I had never met a reporter before. He said, well, you're welcome to come on the show and defend yourself. I said, I'll think about it. Later that week, President Bush gave a press conference. And he was asked about reports from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the International Committee of the Red Cross, saying that the CIA was torturing its prisoners. And Bush just denied it. And then he looked right in the camera and he said, he goes like this, we do not torture. My wife at the time was a senior CIA officer. And I looked at her, I turned to her and I said, he is a bald-faced liar. He's looking the American people in the eye and he's lying to our faces. And then a couple of days later, it's a Friday, Bush is walking from the south portico of the White House to the helicopter to fly to Camp David, and reporters are shouting questions at him. And he turns and he says, well, if there is torture, it's the result of a rogue CIA officer. And I said to my wife, Brian Ross's sources at the White House, and they're going to pin this on me. So I called Brian Ross and I said, I'll give you your interview. And I decided in the week or so before the interview that no matter what he asked me, I was going to tell the truth. So I said 3 things in that interview that just changed the course of the rest of my life. I said that torture was official US government policy. It was not the result of a rogue. I said that the CIA tortured its prisoners as a matter of course. It was just regular, normal, daily job torture. And I said that the torture program had been personally approved by the president himself. And then everything just kind of fell on my head from there.
So you were eventually prosecuted under the Espionage Act and spent 2 years in prison. But when you gave that interview in 2007, did you expect what came after, which was the charges and then eventually prison? Or did you think that was what the result was going to be?
Absolutely did not expect it for a couple of reasons. First of all, I hadn't committed espionage. And the espionage charges were eventually dropped. But number 2, we actually have a law in this country saying that it is illegal to classify a criminal act. You cannot classify something that is a crime for the purpose of keeping the information from the American people. And torture is a crime. First of all, we have something called the Federal Torture Act of 1946. And not only does it outlaw torture, but it specifically outlaws those exact techniques that we used at Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib and the secret sites. Number two, not only are we signatories to the United Nations Convention Against Torture and Inhumane Treatment, we were the authors of the United Nations Convention Against Torture and Inhumane Treatment. I'll give you another example. In 1946, we executed Japanese soldiers who had waterboarded American prisoners of war. That was a death penalty offense, to waterboard someone. In January of 1968, the Washington Post ran a front page photograph of an American soldier waterboarding a North Vietnamese prisoner. On the day that that picture was published, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, ordered an investigation. The soldier was arrested. He was charged with torture, convicted, and sentenced to 20 years of hard labor at Leavenworth. And then in 2002, no problem. We can waterboard anybody we want. The law never changed. The law was never amended. We changed. And we just decided we don't like that law. So we're just going to pretend that it doesn't exist. So somebody had to say something. And I still believe, that because this was a criminal act, exposing it was in the public good, and that I was not in legal danger.
It's amazing to hear about the illegality practiced by the Bush administration and later administrations too, without any pushback from the media or anyone. These people should have been put on trial and put in prison. So you have Brian Ross, who gets a tip from a source, probably at the White House, about you and your involvement in the torture of Abu Zubaydah. You've got President Bush coming out and saying the torture program is the result of some bad apples at the CIA. Do you think that you were right in your suspicions that the White House and George W. Bush administration was trying to pin the torture program on you personally?
Overall, I think I was right. I made one very critical mistake, and this is something that I mention every time I talk to a group of people or talk to a would-be whistleblower. The mistake I made is that I should have hired an attorney skilled in whistleblowing issues or whistleblower protections before I ever opened my mouth. He should have been sitting next to me in that interview. My life would have been vastly different.
So it's fair to say you've had a bit of a transformation since you left the CIA in 2004 and then blew the whistle. And I see this a lot with whistleblowers. They have years and years of imbibing institutional ideology, and then they're free of it, and they're some of the freest minds you can get. I wanted to ask you how you think your worldview has changed since you left the CIA. Your view of the CIA and its role in the world, but also the role of American power in the world.
Wow, literally everything has changed for me. My entire worldview has changed. You know, for many, many, many years, I believed we were the good guys. I really believed we were the good guys. And, you know, now I think back on some of the things that I've said in the past, you know, to friends or colleagues, and I'm ashamed of some of the political positions that I've taken over the years. I've always, all my life, I've considered myself to be a leftist, but a patriot at the same time. Well, you know what? It's patriotic to point your finger at your government and say, you're committing a criminal act and it has to stop. I believe in the Constitution, and the Constitution says you can't do that. So literally, like, everything has changed for me. You know, I'll give you another example. I spent much of my career working on Iraq, a lot, 3/4 of my career working on Iraq. And I remember when Ramsey Clark, the former US Attorney General, went to Iraq before the first Gulf War and met with Saddam Hussein and his two sons, Uday and Qusay Hussein. Uday and Qusay were monsters, sociopaths, psychopaths. But I remember saying to a colleague, Ramsey Clark should be executed for treason, the bastard, providing aid and comfort to the enemy. Well, the truth is, Ramsey Clark was right. I was wrong. And Ramsey Clark and I became friends toward the end of his life. I'll tell you, I'm friends with several released Guantanamo prisoners, where not only do we, email each other back and forth, but I teach a graduate school level class at a university in Europe, and they join my Zoom lectures to answer questions from my students. It's just nuts. Now I get, letters from the likes of, not letters, but emails and phone calls from the likes of Frank Serpico, who was a hero in my house when I was a little kid, or one of my dearest friends, Daniel Ellsberg, who walked me through some really dark, dark days. Giants of this world who also have had their worldviews changed. Dan was a lifelong Republican, of all things, until he saw what was really happening in Vietnam. So, like I said at the start of our talk, I like the person that I am. I'm comfortable with who I am. My children are proud of me, and I know that history is going to smile on me. I did the right thing. I don't care that I went to prison. I wear that as a badge of honor. I've written books about it. So no, I have zero regrets. I would do it again today if I had the opportunity.
Yeah, and it's interesting listening to you, and I feel this with many whistleblowers, is that they speak in a way that's kind of uniquely free, because they've been freed from this institutional pressure and speak from the heart, and also have an insight into how the system really works. As an outsider who's never worked within the system, a lot of us have this impression that there is this permanent government that operates off the books essentially and doesn't change regardless of who the president or the prime minister is. Would you say that's a fair characterization of how the political system works? And also, would you say the situation has got much worse in recent years and the power of these secret agencies has increased?
Oh, it's not gotten worse. It's consistent. The answer is yes. There is a permanent sub-government. Some people call it the deep state. I call it the federal bureaucracy. That's just the system that we've given ourselves. But I'll give you an example. When I was the executive assistant to the deputy director, I hobnobbed literally all day, every day with the senior most officials at the CIA. 90% of them, you wouldn't recognize any of their names. But you get to learn that, oh, this guy over here, he actually is as old as he looks. He got a DCI waiver past his mandatory retirement, and now he's been there for 42 years. Oh, and by the way, he was the chief of station for the Bay of Pigs operation, if you can imagine such a thing. He recently died. You see that guy over there? His career had a major setback because he predicted that the Israelis would not attack in 1967. I was 3 years old in 1967. I'm almost 60. I'm going to be 60 in a couple of weeks. But there are people who have been inside the CIA for that long. And that's what I mean. They know they can outweight these presidents. Presidents come and go, and these guys don't go anywhere.
And how powerful is the CIA within Washington? Because you mentioned the federal bureaucracy, but the CIA is only part of that, and there's many different competing agencies. So in that ecosystem, how powerful is the CIA?
Yeah, the CIA is the premier inter pares of the, not just the intelligence community, but of the foreign policy community. The CIA is on par with state NSC and DoD Joint Chiefs and Office of the Secretary of Defense, OSD. So it's a very small community, right? You have the president, the vice president, the National Security Council, the CIA, the State Department, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the innermost circle of the Office of Secretary of Defense. That's it. Everybody else is a second cousin. Nobody else rises up to that level. And it's not just in foreign policy where the CIA is preeminent. In every national security case, every whistleblower case, the Justice Department will not come to a plea agreement or a sentence recommendation unless the CIA approves of it. And so the CIA was just adamant for almost a year that I do 10 years in prison. And then they came down to 5, and they wouldn't budge from 5. So we had a meeting, my attorneys and I had a meeting with the Justice Department. And I said, I'm not taking 5 years. I'm going to go to trial. And they said, fine, we go to trial. We're going to ask for 18 years. And I said, and I don't even know how I managed the strength to say it. I said, fine, then I'm going to testify on my own behalf. And I might accidentally talk about some of the hideous war crimes and crimes against humanity that I witnessed in 15 years at the CIA. And every national security journalist in Washington is going to be in the courtroom. And then they came back with 23 months. I ended up taking the deal.
And we talked recently about Julian Assange when he was still inside Belmarsh Maximum Security Prison in London. And I remember we both agreed that he had no chance of escaping extradition to the United States. Then, a few months later, we saw that he was on a plane to Australia, a free man. Did that surprise you? And what do you think changed to make the impossible possible?
Yeah, a couple of things changed. First of all, I was very close. I am very close to Julian and to WikiLeaks, and I'm very proud to say that. Several things changed. Number one, this was an anchor around Joe Biden's neck because of a simple mistake that Joe Biden made when he first became president to not dismiss the case. This was Donald Trump's vendetta against Julian Assange. It was Donald Trump that filed these charges. We all know that Barack Obama said he had a New York Times problem, and that's why he didn't charge Julian Assange. So Joe Biden was going to get nothing out of this politically. Number two, and I think this is actually more important, and it's something that was only revealed in an offhanded remark by the judge in Saipan. If you look at the transcript, there's no restitution. So why is there no restitution? Because there's no victim. So this lie that the CIA has perpetuated for all these years, since 2000, whatever it was, 9 or 10, since the Chelsea Manning revelations, this lie that Julian Assange had the blood of American soldiers on his hands, it was just made up out of whole cloth. There was no restitution because there was no victim, and the Justice Department was unable to prove harm to the national security. Now, the reason, just as an aside, the reason why this happened the way it happened was, and you and I had this conversation, literally all of us believed Julian would be extradited to the Eastern District of Virginia, right here in Alexandria, Virginia. And I was hopeful he wouldn't go on trial. I believed that there was a deal to be had and that he would be expelled from the United States to Australia. In fact, Julian put his foot down. While these negotiations were taking place, he still didn't trust that the FBI or the CIA wouldn't just grab him and disappear him once he landed in Virginia. And so what Barry Pollock, his lead attorney, was able to negotiate was that they would agree to plead guilty to one count of conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act, that he would not come to the United States, but instead would be sent for processing to the federal district court physically nearest to Australia. I didn't even know until that day that we have a federal court in Saipan, Northern Mariana Islands. No idea. And it worked. It worked, and he's free, and he's home with his wife and his kids and his family, and he can start a new life.
Yeah, I think it was surprising to all of us that he got out. I mean, I was expecting him to go to the United States. I didn't even think he'd get a deal there. I think he'd be put in some hole in the ground for 20 to 30 years, or maybe the rest of his life. So it was a good result. I just want to ask now about a character called Smedley Butler, who died the most decorated Marine in US history. He signed up to the Marines in the Spanish-American War in 1898 and fought in all the interventions in Central America, China, and other places. But he later on had an awakening and realized that all the stuff had been told about why he was in these places was wrong, and he wasn't there to ensure national security for American people and to protect the American people. He was there for what he called Brown Brothers Bank in New York. He was there for American corporate interests. Would you say you've come to a similar awakening to him, and do you think that that is how US power works? Because the CIA is a different institution to the US military, but it's part of the same tapestry. Are these institutions enforcing US corporate control over the world?
You know, here in the Washington area, we have more millionaires per capita than any other place in America, more than in Silicon Valley. And this is a post 9/11 phenomenon where we have transitioned into a permanent wartime economy. We spend more on so-called defense than the next 8 largest countries combined. Well, that's not just, the president writes checks and just sends checks around. All that money goes to defense and intelligence contractors. And so if we were to suddenly become the country of peace, like we always profess to be, the country of human rights and respect for individual liberties, the economy would literally collapse. And so this is what we've done for ourselves.
I wanted to ask now about the CIA's PR program, because it seems to me that they've used the language of the left to try and co-opt the left to support them. So you see all these campaigns that try to make out the CIA as LGBT friendly and all these things. And then you had the left in the 60s and 70s that understood the role of the CIA around the world and what it did. But now the main supporters of the CIA are the liberal elite and liberals. How did that progression happen? And do you agree that it has happened?
Yeah, and that's exactly why I'm not a Democrat anymore. Yeah, you're right. It's like this complete role reversal. And if Donald Trump wasn't such an insane madman, maybe I would, give consideration to supporting Donald Trump. But yeah, you're right. The Democratic Party is the party of war. It's the party of CIA and operations and anti-terrorism and ever increasing defense budgets. And the parties here are two sides of the same coin. Yeah. And so you're right. The left has been co-opted by the CIA and by the FBI. Can you imagine people who consider themselves to be from the progressive left in the United States now breaking into an FBI field office and stealing the files and setting them on fire, or mailing them to the New York Times to expose, COINTELPRO? Not in a million years. But that's what you were supposed to do if you were a progressive. You were supposed to be in the streets protesting the war, not working with the FBI and the CIA and NSA and the tech giants and, intelligence community contractors. And it's inexplicable to me.
Well, they've put a lot of resources into it, haven't they? They've seen that their main opponents were on the left or on the progressive left, and sought to co-opt them using their own language and their own ideas. And it seems to have worked. I wanted to ask now, because it's a question I'm sure you've been asked many times, and people talk about it all the time, even though it happened a long time ago. Do you think that the CIA was involved in the assassination of JFK?
Oliver Stone and I got into a shouting match about this one time. I have come around to the notion that elements of the CIA were involved in killing John Kennedy. I don't believe that it was a CIA operation, but I think there were senior CIA officers, especially those involved in the Bay of Pigs, that so hated John Kennedy that they set out to kill him. Bob Kennedy is a friend of mine, and we've talked about this a number of times. He told me a story once that was just so fascinating. He said on the day that his uncle was killed, November 22nd, 1963, he was in 7th grade. And his mother picked him up at school early and brought him home. And she said, something terrible has happened. And she told him. The Kennedy family lived in McLean, Virginia, in a mansion called Hickory Hill, just half a mile from the CIA's headquarters. Bobby Kennedy Sr. was very, very close to the CIA's director, John McCone. They went to church together. Their wives socialized. But John McCone's wife had died of breast cancer several months earlier, and he was despondent. And the Kennedys were afraid he was going to commit suicide. So he would have dinner with the Kennedys every single night, and then he and Bobby Kennedy would swim together in the pool, and then McCone would go home. So when RFK Jr. got out of the car that day, he said his father and McCone were deep in conversation. And as he walked past them, he heard his father say, "Tell me your people didn't do this." And McCone said, "I don't know who did it." I'll add that declassified documents show that within 20 or 30 minutes of the assassination, the Soviets came to us and said, "We swear to God it wasn't us." The Cubans did the same thing. The East Germans did the same thing. Wasn't us. And so, you have to think about, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but you have to think about this odd statement from Lee Harvey Oswald, "I'm just a patsy." For whom? And then if he's a patsy, and you can't pin this on the communists because there's literally no evidence that it was Soviets or Cubans or any other communists, then cui bono? And so I've finally come to the conclusion that, yeah, it was elements of the CIA. Yes. Okay. Now, Bob Jr. or Bob Sr., Bobby Jr. stands alone in his family in his position that Sirhan was innocent. There were more bullets fired than Sirhan had in his gun, so there had to be a second shooter. We know that Kennedy was also hit, what was it, from the front, and Sirhan was behind him, or vice versa. There had to be a second shooter. I've always been of the belief that it was probably that redneck sheriff from Alabama or Mississippi or wherever he was, although he claims not to have gotten a shot off. I don't know. But I never heard anything at the CIA that they were involved.
So for my book, I went to Honduras and Bolivia to look into what the Drug Enforcement Administration was doing there, which is a US agency and the central body of the war on drugs. And what it seemed to me was that the drug war is an excuse that took off after the end of the Cold War to keep a high troop level and high military and intelligence presence in Latin America. You saw it from the inside. Do you think the war on drugs, obviously the CIA is part of that, is about drugs, or is it about something else? And that's internationally. Domestically, there's a whole other issue, which is that the CIA were alleged to be involved in the crack epidemic, which took off in the United States in the 80s. It was revealed by Gary Webb, a journalist who eventually died. So what is the reality of the war on drugs? Is it what we're told?
I'll begin by asking you a question. Have you ever seen the Netflix series Narcos?
Yeah.
Okay. So you know how the good guys are the DEA agents, and just as they're going to go in and capture the cartel head, the CIA guy comes in and screws everything up. Yeah, that's real life, because the CIA doesn't give a shit about drugs. The CIA gives a shit about running their arms and communism and counterterrorism and influence. They don't care about drugs. They laugh at those DEA guys. The cocaine situation in the 80s with Nicaragua. We don't need to get into the details, but there's credible evidence that at the very, very least, the CIA decided to look the other way as that cocaine was sent to the United States to be made into crack to change the completely American society of the period. That's number one. Number two, when when I was the senior investigator on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee from 2009 to 2011, John Kerry asked me to go to Afghanistan to do an in-depth study on heroin poppy. Afghanistan produced 93% of the world's heroin. 93% of the world's heroin. So I went out there. I helicoptered down to Lashkar Gah, the capital of Helmand. Just a terrible place. And I had a military escort who didn't want me to do anything. And I put my foot down. So I said, no, we're driving out to the poppy fields and I'm going to talk to a poppy farmer. So we go out there and we find this poppy farmer. And I asked him what now I recognize as the most embarrassingly naive question I possibly could have asked. I said, listen, instead of poppy, why don't you grow things that have 2 growing seasons, like onions or wheat or pomegranates? And he goes like this. The Americans told me in 2001 that if I told them where the Arabs were, I could grow all the poppy I wanted. I said, what Americans told you could grow poppy? And my military handler says, we got to go. This is too dangerous. And he physically grabbed me by the shirt and pulled me to the Jeep and took me back to the helicopter. And we flew back to Bagram. So I go to see a senior DEA agent here in Washington when I came back. And I told him this story. And he goes, are you kidding me? He said, we don't want to solve the Afghan poppy problem. I said, why not? He said, because all that heroin goes to Russia and Iran, and we want them to be addicted to heroin. He said, Russia and Iran have the highest rate of opioid addiction on the planet. We want them to be addicted to it. And so that was the end of it. I never published the piece. It didn't make any sense to. Like, oh, well, we're encouraging the Taliban to grow as much heroin poppy as they possibly can to get as many people addicted as they possibly can, because somehow that makes us a stronger and safer country.
And last question is about the United States, because your country is in a real mess and it really is a tinderbox. There's huge amounts of social problems. The political system is being stretched as much as it can possibly be stretched. And I think recently we saw the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, which failed. If that had succeeded, you have millions of his followers who are armed and who would have been outraged and already think the deep state is out to get them and Donald Trump. They would have been emboldened. And I don't think it's over the top to say that could have created the conditions, at least, for civil war. So I wanted to ask, if you were an intelligence officer, an analyst for a foreign power and writing a report about the United States, what would you be writing now? How dangerous do you think this moment is for the United States?
I think we're right on an edge right now. I think we would have been pushed over that edge had Donald Trump been killed. I think we might still fall off that edge if Donald Trump loses and the election is very close, or if he wins the popular vote and loses the electoral vote. We have literally hundreds of militias, extra constitutional militias around the country. Almost all of them are extreme in their right-wing views. And I think we need to worry about them. I really do. I've never felt like this in my life. Never. And, I have friends who are older than I am. Like I said, I'm going to be 60 in a couple of weeks. But, even back in 68, where our political leaders were being shot and killed and, and there are riots in the streets and buildings are on fire. But this just seems more frightening to me than that. It seems to me like a powder keg where things are okay right now, but we've got the potential for the whole country just to go right to hell. And we're not safe yet. We have to see how things work out by November.